Exposed at the altar. The marriage confession that turned tragic. Criminal story. Claire had always imagined her wedding day in great detail, long before the engagement ring sparkled on her finger. It was a vision built on years of dreaming, the culmination of everything she had hoped for in a marriage, a promise of love, stability, and eternal togetherness. She had envisioned the white roses, the soft strains of the violin, the nervous excitement in her heart as she walked down the aisle, and the adoration in David's eyes. This was the moment she had been waiting for, a dream realized. She was marrying David, the man she believed to be the love of her life, the man she trusted more than anyone else in the world. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. The church was a beautiful old stone building on the outskirts of town, a place that seemed to echo with history. Its soaring columns and intricate stained glass windows were as timeless as the love Claire felt. It was here, in the hushed sanctity of this church, that Claire was about to embark on the next chapter of her life. The pews were filled with family and friends, their faces glowing with joy and excitement. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers and polished wood, creating an atmosphere of warmth and anticipation. Every detail was perfect, the white floral arrangements lining the aisle, the soft gold accents of the altar, and the gentle flicker of candles casting a serene light across the room. Everything was set. Claire could feel the nervous energy rising within her, but it was more the kind of nervousness that accompanied any major life change. Her heart fluttered in anticipation, and there was a weight on her chest that only intensified as she stood with David in front of the altar. They hadn't yet exchanged vows, but she could feel her heart swelling as she gazed into his eyes. David had always been her rock, the person who knew her better than anyone else. His warm smile made everything seem right in the world. David looked perfect, his dark hair combed neatly, his tuxedo sharp and elegant. He stood tall, his posture confident, as though nothing could disturb the moment. His blue eyes, always so full of emotion, were fixed on her with a tenderness that made Claire feel safe, cherished, and adored. The man who had promised her love forever, who had supported her through tough times, and whose laughter had made everything lighter, was standing there beside her. The man who would soon be her husband. The ceremony had already begun. The officiant, a calm, older man, began the processional, his voice warm and reassuring as he called them to this sacred union. Claire tried to listen to his words, but her mind kept drifting to David, to the promises they would make, to the future that awaited them. There was so much excitement in the air that it felt as though time itself had slowed down. The words of the vows were coming, and she felt her pulse quicken. It would be the moment that sealed their future together. But amid the joy, Claire couldn't shake an odd feeling, a strange sense of foreboding. It wasn't a fear, exactly, more like a slight hesitation in the back of her mind, a nagging doubt that she couldn't quite place. Everything was perfect, yet there was something subtle that she couldn't ignore. She pushed it away, telling herself it was simply nerves. It was her wedding day, after all, and who could blame her for feeling the weight of such a monumental commitment? Her mind reassured her that everything would be fine. She was marrying David, the man she loved. What could possibly go wrong? As the officiant spoke about the nature of love, Claire's eyes wandered to the guests sitting in the pews. Her mother, sitting in the front row, smiled at her with pride, and her best friend from college, Julia, gave her a thumbs up from the back. Claire's father, who had passed away a few years earlier, was represented by an empty seat at the front, his memory lingering with her in spirit. There was a deep sense of connection with the people around her, and as the ceremony unfolded, Claire's heart swelled with love, not just for David but for the life they were about to build together. Everything felt right, and in that moment, she could not imagine a future without him by her side. David was smiling at her now, his lips curling up into that easy, affectionate grin she had come to love. His expression was warm and soft, as though nothing could ever break the bond between them. She smiled back, feeling the familiar rush of affection that came with knowing someone for years, sharing secrets, dreams, and fears. She could picture it, Her and David, growing old together, building a family, supporting one another through thick and thin. It was the future she had always dreamed of. The officiant continued, and Claire's thoughts began to drift again, this time to their journey as a couple. From their first date at a cozy cafe to their long walks through the park, to the late-night talks about everything and nothing, their relationship had always been a series of beautiful, quiet moments. The way David held her hand when they watched a movie, the way he brushed his thumb against her cheek when she was sad, the way he was always there when she needed him most. These were the small things that had made their love so deep and effortless. Claire couldn't imagine a life without those moments. The officiant's voice cut through her reverie, and she realized that they were nearing the point of exchanging vows. The moment of truth. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, louder now as she realized the magnitude of what they were about to do. She was about to marry David. The thought sent a surge of emotion through her chest. Her life was about to change in the most profound way possible, and despite the small, nagging doubts still lingering at the edges of her mind, Claire knew this was what she wanted. This was the future she had envisioned. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise. The sound of the church doors swinging open, a loud crash that echoed through the silence. Claire's heart skipped a beat, and she turned instinctively toward the back of the church. The moment was broken. The guests murmured in confusion as a figure stepped into the doorway, a woman, her face flushed and her clothes disheveled. Claire froze, her gaze locked on the stranger. The woman was out of breath, her eyes wide with panic, and as she walked down the aisle toward the altar, all eyes turned to her. She looked around, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, before she spoke in a voice that trembled with urgency. "Stop the ceremony," she shouted. Her words sliced through the air like a knife. "I'm Sarah," she continued, her eyes darting nervously between Claire and David, "and I'm pregnant with David's child." The world seemed to slow as Claire's mind struggled to comprehend what she had just heard. Her heart, which had been soaring only moments before, now crashed in her chest. Sarah? Pregnant? With David's child? The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. Claire felt her stomach twist into a tight knot, her head spinning with confusion. David's expression was a mixture of shock and guilt, and Claire could see the subtle tremble in his hands as he moved toward her, his face paling. "Claire," he said, his voice low, as though struggling to find the right words, "I was going to tell you. I never meant for you to find out like this. Please let me explain." The officiant, still in shock, stood frozen beside them, not knowing how to respond to the unexpected interruption. The guests whispered among themselves, their confused murmurs filling the church, but Claire's focus was entirely on David. Her heart was racing now, her thoughts swirling. Everything she had known about her relationship with David, everything she had trusted, was suddenly called into question. How could this happen? How could David, the man who had promised her forever, be keeping such a devastating secret? As Sarah stood there, her face a mixture of regret and determination, Claire felt her knees weaken beneath her. She grabbed onto the edge of the altar for support, trying to steady herself. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But as Sarah continued to explain how her affair with David had begun months ago and how she had recently discovered she was pregnant, Claire's heart sank deeper and deeper into a pit of disbelief. Claire looked at David, her voice barely a whisper as she asked, "Is this true? Is it true, David? What she's saying?" But the words that followed, David's apology, his explanation, couldn't reach her. It was too late. The man she had thought she knew, the man she had trusted with her heart, had betrayed her in the worst way possible. The foundation of their entire relationship had been built on lies, and now the truth was crashing down around her. The guests continued to whisper, but Claire could no longer hear them. The pain was too loud, too consuming. She turned and ran, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of the betrayal. She needed to get away. She needed to find air, to breathe, to think, but all she could hear in her head was the sound of Sarah's words, "I'm pregnant with David's child." Claire's legs moved on their own as she stumbled toward the exit, her mind frozen in disbelief. She had heard the words, "I'm pregnant with David's child," but they hadn't truly registered in her mind. It was as if the ground beneath her was crumbling, and everything she had built her life upon was now shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Her body felt numb, and the air around her seemed thick, as though the weight of the revelation pressed down on her chest with every breath. As she reached the heavy wooden doors of the church, Claire's hands gripped the brass handles, her fingers slick with sweat. She flung them open, and as the cold air hit her face, she staggered out onto the church steps, gasping for breath. The world outside seemed just as foreign as the chaos she had left behind. There was no comfort in the open space, no clarity in the overwhelming swirl of emotions. She could hear the muffled sounds of her guests' murmurs coming from inside, but it all seemed so far away now. Her world had become a blur. All she could feel was the sharp pain radiating from her chest and the confusion that clouded her thoughts. Claire's mind was in turmoil, her thoughts racing faster than she could process. How could this happen? She wondered desperately, the words echoing in her head. How could David do this to me? She had always believed that their love was pure, that they shared something deep and unshakable. For years, David had been her rock, the person who understood her better than anyone else, the person she had confided in, laughed with, dreamed of a future with. How could he betray her like this? How could he have lied to her for so long, hiding an affair that was now so brutally exposed? She walked aimlessly, her mind locked in a storm of disbelief. She passed the neatly manicured lawns of the church property, the familiar stone walls now seeming like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. The birds that fluttered overhead, the soft hum of the distant traffic, all of it felt surreal, as if she were floating through some alternate version of reality. Nothing made sense anymore. Her legs moved faster as her anger began to surface, the confusion giving way to a deep, simmering fury. Claire was never one to get angry quickly. She was calm, reserved, and often the one who tried to keep the peace. But now, her fury surged through her like a tidal wave, and she found herself picking up speed, her footsteps pounding the pavement beneath her. She had been humiliated, betrayed, and her heart, her trusting, open heart, had been shattered into pieces. And it was all because of David. David, she thought, and the bitterness that filled her chest almost made her choke. How could he do this to her? It wasn't just the affair, it was everything. The lies, the years of trust that he had chipped away, piece by piece. How could she have been so blind? How had she not seen the signs? She had known David for years. They had been through so much together. How could he have kept something so monumental from her? How could he have hurt her in this way? Her mind flashed back to the moments before the woman, Sarah, had interrupted the ceremony. Claire had been so caught up in the excitement of her wedding day, so wrapped up in the dream she had built in her mind, that she had never once considered the possibility of something going wrong. David had seemed so perfect in those moments. She had looked into his eyes and believed in their shared future. She had trusted him. But now, everything was different. It was too much to comprehend, too much to absorb in the span of a few minutes. She was supposed to be getting married, surrounded by the people she loved, and yet here she was alone, outside, walking in a daze, her heart crushed. She stopped for a moment, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. Claire placed a hand on her forehead, trying to collect her thoughts, but they kept slipping away. She could still hear Sarah's voice in her mind. "I'm pregnant with David's child." It repeated like a mantra, and each time it resounded in her head, her chest tightened. She closed her eyes and took a few deep breaths, willing herself to stop shaking, to regain some semblance of control. But it was impossible. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered aloud, her voice shaky. "Why did he wait until today? Why?" She stumbled again, the weight of the question threatening to crush her. "Why didn't he tell me earlier? Why didn't I see the signs?" As Claire walked, she didn't notice that she had left the church grounds entirely. She had wandered into the small park across the street, the one she and David used to visit on lazy Sunday afternoons when they were younger. Back then, it had been their place, away from the world, a quiet space where they could talk and dream. How naive she had been, sitting on that bench, imagining their future, thinking that nothing could tear them apart. Now, the park felt like a cruel reminder of what she had lost. The space that once held her happiest memories now seemed tainted, as if everything connected to David had become contaminated by this horrible truth. Finally, unable to walk any longer, Claire sank onto a nearby bench. She pressed her hands to her face, as if somehow trying to block out the pain. She tried to breathe, but the air felt heavy, suffocating. Pregnant with David's child. The words continued to loop through her mind, and she couldn't escape them. It was like a wound that would never heal. Every time she tried to move past it, to push it away, it returned even sharper, even more painful. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, but Claire didn't look at it. She knew it was David. He had probably tried to call her 100 times already. But how could she speak to him? How could she look at him after what had just happened? He had just stood there, silent, guilty, incapable of offering any kind of explanation that could justify what had happened. His eyes had pleaded with her for forgiveness, but it was too late. She couldn't look at him the same way ever again. She thought about the ceremony, the vows that had been meant to bind them forever, the promises that had been made. All of it was now meaningless. She had thought she knew David. She had thought that their love was real, built on years of trust and mutual respect. And maybe it had been once. But the moment Sarah had walked through those church doors and spoken the truth, everything had fallen apart. Claire's breath quickened again. The anger was rising, bubbling up to the surface like an uncontrollable wave. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the intense frustration and betrayal that had become all-consuming. She couldn't even look at him. David, the man she had chosen to marry, the man who had promised her forever, without feeling the sting of betrayal deep in her heart. How could she ever trust him again? The question gnawed at her insides. Claire stood suddenly, the rage inside her igniting a spark of movement. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to leave. She couldn't stay here, surrounded by memories of a love that no longer felt real. She couldn't bear the thought of walking back to that church, facing the people who had witnessed her humiliation. She couldn't face David, couldn't face the life they had planned to build together. In her haste, Claire didn't notice the tears that had begun to fall until they blurred her vision. She wiped them away quickly, but they kept coming, as though her body could no longer hold back the floodgates of grief. She wanted to scream, to break something, to do anything that would make the pain stop. But there was nothing. No one could take this away. No one could fix it. The reality was that everything she had once believed about her life, about her love for David, had been shattered in an instant. She had been living in a fantasy, and now she was forced to confront the truth. How could I have been so blind? She thought again, her mind spiraling deeper into the questions that would haunt her for a long time to come. She had been so caught up in the idea of their future that she hadn't noticed the cracks forming beneath the surface. She had loved David so completely, so unconditionally, that she had never questioned him, never wondered if there was something more he was hiding. And now that truth was laid bare before her, and it hurt more than she could have ever imagined. For the first time in a long time, Claire felt completely and utterly alone. She was surrounded by people, by family, by friends, but no one could understand the depth of her pain. No one could feel the betrayal she was feeling. David's betrayal wasn't just about the affair, it was about everything. The lies, the broken trust, the shattered foundation. And for the first time, Claire realized that she didn't know who David was anymore. She needed to get away. She needed time to think, to process. But most of all, she needed to get away from the man who had once been the love of her life. The man who had now become a stranger. Claire had no clear destination in mind as she stormed away from the church, her mind still a jumbled mess of confusion and fury. The streets before her blurred as she walked faster, the sounds of the world muffled by the thundering pulse in her ears. The weight of betrayal hung over her like a cloud, dark and suffocating. She didn't know where to go or what to do. All she could think about was escaping, getting as far away from David and the life she had once known as possible. Her feet took her through the familiar streets of the town, but everything felt foreign now. The faces of strangers that passed her by seemed like distant echoes, and the buildings, once a comforting backdrop to her life, now looked like silent witnesses to her personal tragedy. The world around her continued to move in its usual rhythm, but Claire felt as though she were moving through some strange, parallel universe, one where nothing was as it seemed and everything had been turned upside down. She kept walking, each step a physical manifestation of her desire to run, to put as much distance between herself and the church as possible. The wedding had been a blur, an almost surreal moment she couldn't seem to erase from her mind. Sarah's words, so sharp and devastating, still rang in her ears. "I'm pregnant with David's child." Every time she replayed them in her mind, a fresh wave of anger and hurt swept over her. The fact that it was happening now, at her wedding, only added to the crushing weight of the situation. It was too much. Too overwhelming. Her feet carried her to the edge of town, where the residential areas began to thin out, giving way to open fields and distant hills. Claire didn't stop to think. She wasn't sure why she was heading this way, but her body felt compelled to keep moving. The streets had grown quieter, the houses smaller and more spread out. As she walked, she felt a strange sense of isolation settle over her, like a cold, uncomfortable cloak. It seemed fitting. She had always prided herself on her independence, on being able to handle things on her own. But now, in the aftermath of everything that had happened, Claire felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. It wasn't just the betrayal by David that left her feeling isolated. It was the realization that, in some way, she had been living a lie. All the years she had spent with him, building their life together, were now clouded by the realization that those years had been tainted by deception. The intimacy they had shared, the way he had held her when she was upset, the way he had whispered sweet nothings in her ear on lazy Sunday mornings, all of it now seemed false, tainted by the secret he had kept from her. Claire could no longer trust the man she had spent so many years with. That thought alone made her want to scream, to tear at the fabric of everything she had once believed in. The sky above her was a dull, overcast gray, the clouds hanging low as if mirroring her mood. It felt like the whole world was in mourning, as though it, too, had suffered some great loss. Claire didn't know what she was searching for. Perhaps solace, perhaps answers, but she knew that she couldn't go back to the church. She couldn't face David, not yet. Not with everything still so raw. She needed time. Time to think. Time to breathe. Time to make sense of the chaos that had suddenly consumed her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't look at it. She knew it was David, trying to reach her again. It felt like a lifetime since she had last heard his voice, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. How could she? What was there to say? The man who had promised her his heart had just shattered it into pieces, and she had no idea how to begin putting them back together. She couldn't face him. Not yet. Claire's footsteps slowed as she reached a small park at the edge of the town. The park was empty, save for a few scattered leaves that danced across the path in the breeze. It was a peaceful place, the kind of place she and David used to visit together when they were younger, long before they had decided to get married. Back then, it had been their escape, a quiet corner of the world where they could be themselves, away from the noise of life. The memories of their carefree afternoons spent here, talking about the future, laughing about nothing, flooded her mind. Those memories were now tainted, poisoned by the knowledge of David's betrayal. Claire hesitated for a moment before walking to one of the empty benches and sitting down. She put her head in her hands, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. How had she gotten here? How had she come so far, only to have her world collapse in a matter of moments? She had always thought she knew what her future held. She had always believed in the love she shared with David. She had trusted him. But now, that trust was shattered, broken beyond repair. The future she had once envisioned was gone, replaced by a gaping void that she had no idea how to fill. Her thoughts drifted back to the confrontation in the church. The look on David's face, the mixture of guilt and panic in his eyes. It had been as though he knew that nothing he said could ever fix what had just happened. And yet he had tried. His voice, trembling as he called after her, begged her to let him explain. But what was there to explain? What excuse could he possibly offer that would make this okay? How could she ever look at him the same way again after this? The thought of hearing him say that he was sorry, that he had made a mistake, felt hollow and meaningless. Claire's eyes wandered across the park as she sat in silence, her mind continuing to race. A part of her wanted to understand what had happened. She needed to make sense of it, to find some kind of closure. But no matter how hard she tried, the answers remained elusive. Why had David done this? How long had this affair been going on? Had she truly not seen the signs? Had she been so blind, so trusting, that she had allowed him to deceive her for so long? The questions consumed her, but no answers came. There was no way to reconcile what had happened. There was no way to make sense of the inexplicable. The life she had built with David had been a lie, and Claire realized, with a sickening clarity, that she had been living in a fantasy. The woman she thought she was, the one who had stood there just hours before, on the brink of marriage, was now a stranger to her. How could she ever go back to the person she was before? The past no longer felt like a part of her. It felt distant, as if it had happened to someone else entirely. Claire rose from the bench, her body stiff and exhausted. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't keep reliving the same memories over and over again. She needed to do something. She needed to take control of her life again, to regain some semblance of power in a world that had so suddenly spiraled out of her control. Her eyes scanned the horizon, and she noticed a small cafe at the far end of the park, tucked away in a corner between two buildings. Without thinking, she started walking toward it, her steps purposeful now, though her mind was still clouded by the storm inside her. As she entered the cafe, the soft hum of conversation and the aroma of fresh coffee filled her senses. It was warm here, a comforting contrast to the cold, gray day outside. The familiarity of the place, small, cozy, and filled with the quiet murmur of people lost in their own worlds, was oddly soothing. She made her way to a corner booth and sat down, staring out the window, still lost in thought. The outside world seemed so far removed from her reality now, like an entirely different plane of existence. For the first time since the ceremony, Claire allowed herself to breathe. She closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on the stillness of the cafe. She didn't know what she was doing here, what she expected to find. But somehow, the quiet was exactly what she needed. Time to think. Time to process. The door of the cafe opened, and Claire's heart skipped a beat as she turned her head. But it wasn't David. It was just another customer, another face in the crowd, another stranger who had no idea that her world had just been destroyed. The moment passed, but it reminded her of something crucial. She was truly alone in this. She couldn't rely on anyone else to fix it. She couldn't expect anyone to understand the pain she was feeling. And that, more than anything, terrified her. How could she move forward from here? How could she rebuild the pieces of her life when everything she had known had been ripped away in an instant? It felt impossible. But Claire knew that, somehow, she had to. She didn't have a choice. The world outside was waiting, and though she didn't yet know how, she had to find a way to step back into it. To find herself again. To find a way forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the menu, as if the simple task of ordering a coffee was somehow a small act of defiance against the overwhelming storm inside her. She had to start somewhere. And right now, this small, quiet moment was all she had. But even as she stared at the menu, her mind kept returning to one haunting question. What would she do now? Claire stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She hadn't expected the wedding to go this way. Not in a million years. The chaos of what had just happened, the betrayal, the shock, the rawness of the truth that had been exposed, felt like a suffocating storm, and she was caught right in the center of it. The feelings she was experiencing were still overwhelming and far too new to even process. At first, When she ran out of the church, her instincts had only been to escape. The world inside had felt like a cage, a place where her pain, her humiliation, her shock, was on display for everyone to witness. Claire didn't want to be seen like that. She didn't want anyone to witness the unraveling of her life. She had fled, not knowing where she was going or even what she hoped to find. Now, sitting in the small cafe at the edge of town, the world felt quieter, but not necessarily clearer. The storm inside her was still raging, but at least there was distance between her and the wedding guests, between her and the man who would shatter her world. She had made it this far, but what now? What was she supposed to do in the aftermath of all this? The muted hum of the cafe around her felt oddly grounding, like a lifeline she hadn't expected to grab onto. She had to make a decision. The old Claire, the practical one, the one who planned and organized her life, was nowhere to be found. The pain was too raw, the betrayal too sharp. But she could no longer ignore the fact that she was standing on the precipice of something she couldn't undo. The relationship, the life she had built with David, was gone. She wasn't sure if it had ever been as real as she thought it was. But she had to keep moving forward. Somehow, Claire's hand trembled slightly as she took a sip from her coffee, the warmth spreading through her fingers. It was the first time in hours that she had allowed herself to stop, to breathe, to actually sit down and try to process what had happened. But the processing was far from easy. She felt like she was walking in a fog, grappling with the shock of David's betrayal and trying to find a way to stand back up. In a way, sitting in this cafe was symbolic of her new reality. The cafe was warm, but still, Claire felt like she was in a foreign space. It wasn't just the newness of the location. It was the disorienting sense of losing control over her life. She had always been someone who knew where she was going, who could anticipate the next step. But now, she had no idea what came next. She felt like she was free-falling, her identity tied so closely to David, to the life they had shared, that it was almost impossible to think about what her future might look like without him. How could I have not seen this coming? The thought kept circling in her mind. Her chest tightened at the memory of Sarah's voice, confident and calm as she'd made her announcement. Pregnant with David's child. Those words had cut through Claire like a knife, their impact still raw and fresh, reverberating through her bones. The image of Sarah standing there at the altar had been so surreal. The wedding was supposed to be her moment, a culmination of everything she and David had worked toward. How could everything have come crashing down so quickly? She closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady her breath. Focus, she told herself. You can do this. The world outside was still waiting for her to move. She couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Her mind spun in 100 different directions, but there was one thing that was clear. She had to adapt to this new life, this new truth. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen all at once, but Claire had no other choice. She had to find a way to reclaim herself from the wreckage. As Claire left the cafe, the quiet of the world around her seemed to mock her. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The evening air was crisp, with just enough of a chill to make her wrap her arms around herself. It was a peaceful evening, and yet, Claire felt as though everything around her was moving too fast, too easily, while she was stuck. She couldn't stop looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see David, desperate to explain himself, following her, apologizing, begging for another chance. But David was nowhere to be seen. And, for the first time since she had run out of the church, Claire realized that perhaps she didn't want to see him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The very thought of him, of what he had done, felt like a wound that hadn't begun to heal. She wasn't sure if she could ever heal from it. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to. But she couldn't ignore him forever. Could she? After all, they had shared a life together. A life full of moments, of laughter, of dreams. Their relationship had been the foundation of everything she knew. How could she walk away from that without even trying to understand it? To understand him? But as much as Claire's rational mind told her that she needed closure, she also understood that she wasn't ready. Not now. Maybe not for a long time. The more Claire walked, the more she realized that she was trying to outrun her own thoughts, and that wasn't going to work. She had to face them. The anger, the sadness, the feelings of betrayal and helplessness. They were all part of her now, and she had to make peace with them. That didn't mean forgiving David, not yet anyway, but it did mean coming to terms with the fact that this was her reality now. And somehow, she had to adapt to it. That evening, Claire found herself standing in front of her apartment building, her eyes fixed on the door as if it held the answers to all her questions. It was quiet here, so quiet. Her apartment was supposed to be a refuge, a place where she could unwind and feel safe. But now, standing in front of it, she realized it had become something else, a symbol of everything she had lost. The future she had envisioned with David, the life they were supposed to build together, was now as distant as the stars. And the thought of stepping back into that apartment, of sitting in the spaces where they had laughed and talked and made plans, felt suffocating. She didn't know if she was ready to go inside. But then, she realized there was no other choice. This was the life she had now. This was what she had to rebuild. She had to make it her own. It would take time, it would be painful, but it was the only way forward. Claire pushed open the door to her apartment, the familiar sound of the hinges creaking as it swung inward. The air inside felt stale, as though the space had been holding its breath while she had been out. She stepped inside, looking around at the space she had shared with David, at the photos of their travels, the little mementos from their time together. They were everywhere. It felt like the walls themselves were whispering his name. She walked slowly through the living room, her fingers brushing the soft fabrics of the couch cushions, as though trying to touch the past one last time. She didn't know how long she stood there, her mind floating in a haze of memories and heartbreak. But eventually, Claire realized that she couldn't keep living in the past. She couldn't keep holding onto the idea of the life she had imagined. That life had ended the moment Sarah had walked into the church. The reality of what had happened began to settle into her bones. As much as she wanted to deny it, Claire knew that this was now her life. And somehow, she was going to have to rebuild it. There was no going back to who she was before, no magical erasure of the pain she felt. But she couldn't let that keep her from moving forward. Claire stood in the middle of her apartment, staring at the photos, the mementos, the remnants of a relationship that no longer existed. But for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of determination. She could do this. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but she could adapt. She would adapt. With that thought, Claire took a deep breath and set her gaze on the horizon beyond her window. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone in this. She had herself. And that, for now, was enough to begin the journey back to a life that was truly hers. For the first time since the wedding, Claire felt an overwhelming desire to do something, to take control of a situation that had been slipping through her fingers for too long. The chaos of the church, the devastation she had felt in that moment of betrayal, had left her reeling. But now, back in the familiar, sterile confines of her apartment, she realized that running away from her problems wasn't going to change anything. She needed to fix something, to feel as though she had regained some measure of power. And so, she decided to confront David. It wasn't a decision made lightly. Every instinct within her screamed to shut him out, to keep him at arm's length forever. But another part of her, the part still grappling with the life they had built together, wanted to hear him out, to try to understand what had led him to do what he did. Maybe if she could just make sense of it all, she could start to rebuild. Maybe this confrontation would give her the closure she needed. That night, Claire texted David, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. She wasn't sure what to say or even how to phrase it, but she knew that if they were going to have any chance of moving forward, either together or apart, there needed to be a conversation. There needed to be a reckoning. A truth. She waited for his reply, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat. Each message from him seemed to further confuse her feelings, pulling her in two directions at once. One message was an apology, the next an explanation of how deeply he regretted his actions. Then came another, more desperate, pleading for her to give him another chance. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, David responded, asking if they could meet. Claire agreed. She didn't know what she was hoping for, or if it was even possible, but a part of her still clung to the idea that maybe this conversation could provide the clarity she desperately sought. The next morning, Claire met David at a small cafe at the edge of town, a neutral space, somewhere in between their old world and the new reality that had started to unfold. The place was familiar enough for both of them to feel comfortable, but it wasn't filled with the emotional baggage of their past. There was a heavy air between them, the unspoken tension hanging thick, but neither of them seemed to know where to begin. David arrived first, looking weary, his face drawn and tired. Claire had never seen him like this before, not in all their years together. He had always been so assured, so confident, even when things weren't perfect. But now, he looked small, vulnerable, as if the weight of the world had settled upon his shoulders. He stood up when she entered, his eyes filled with a combination of hope and regret. "Claire," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do, and now I'm so sorry." Claire felt a sharp pang in her chest. His apology wasn't just an apology, it was a plea for forgiveness, for understanding. But the truth was, Claire didn't know if she could offer either. How could she? He had betrayed her in the worst possible way, and yet here he was, standing in front of her, as though nothing had happened. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat tightened, and she had to take a deep breath before she could finally muster the strength to speak. "David," she began, her voice colder than she had intended. "How long were you going to keep this from me? How long?" The words hit him like a physical blow. He winced, his expression twisting with guilt. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to lose you. You didn't know how to tell me?" Claire's voice rose trembling with barely contained rage. "You didn't know how to tell me that you've been sleeping with someone else for months? And now, what? You expect me to just forgive you? Just like that?" She slammed her hand against the table, startling a few other customers nearby, but she didn't care. "How could you do this to me? To us?" David looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't want this to happen," he said again, his voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this. I love you, Claire. I do. I always have. But this thing with Sarah, it just happened. It wasn't planned. I didn't want to hurt you." The words felt hollow to Claire, like a weak attempt to justify the unjustifiable. His tone, though pleading, didn't make her feel better. It made her feel worse. She had always believed that their relationship was built on mutual respect and trust, but now she realized how naive she had been. How could I not have seen it? She wondered. How could I have been so blind? And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of betrayal, Claire couldn't deny that she still loved him. She hated herself for it, but it was true. The reality of what had happened, the sharp, ugly truth of it, was almost too much to process, but the emotional bond between them was still there. It lingered like a ghost, haunting her thoughts. "So, what now, David?" Claire's voice was quieter now, the anger still simmering beneath the surface, but tempered by a more cynical realization. "What do you want from me? Another chance?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly as he tried to touch hers. "Please, Claire," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I've ruined everything, but I swear to you, I'll do anything. I'll prove to you that I'm sorry. I'll leave Sarah. I'll do whatever it takes." Her heart twisted painfully at his words. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the rawness of his emotions. But Claire knew, deep down, that it wasn't that simple. Could she ever trust him again? Could she ever look at him without seeing Sarah's face, without remembering the way he had looked at her when he had promised her the world, only to give it away for something else? Could she go back to the life they had shared, the life that seemed to crumble away with every passing moment? "I don't know if I can," she said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. What you've done, David, it's unforgivable. I don't even know if I can ever feel safe with you again." David's face fell. His eyes watered, but he didn't look away. "Please," he said again, his voice desperate. "I love you, Claire. I need you. I don't know what to do without you." The desperation in his voice hit Claire harder than she expected. The air between them was charged, thick with unsaid things, with emotions neither of them knew how to process. She felt her own resolve weakening, even as her mind screamed at her to hold firm, to protect herself. But the heart, that unreliable, fragile thing, was still drawn to him, still yearning for the life they had almost had. "I can't decide right now," she whispered, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. "I need time." David nodded slowly, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I'll wait for you, Claire. No matter how long it takes, I'll wait." And with that, it felt as if everything hung in the balance. Claire wasn't sure what she had just done. Had she made the right decision? Had she given in to a part of her that was too weak to let go of him? Or was she simply giving herself the space to figure out what came next? For the first time since the wedding, Claire left the cafe feeling like she had achieved something, a small victory. She had gotten what she wanted. She had confronted him, heard his apologies, felt his pain. She had given herself the option to choose, either to walk away or to give him another chance. But in reality, it was a false victory. Claire had gotten her moment of control, but the decision wasn't truly hers to make just yet. The betrayal, the confusion, the rawness of her emotions were still there, swirling within her. And the real battle, she realized, wasn't about forgiving David. It was about forgiving herself for having been blind to the truth, for having trusted him when perhaps, deep down, she had known something was wrong. As she walked back to her apartment, Claire realized that the road ahead was far more uncertain than she had hoped. She had won a small victory in confronting David, but it was only the beginning of a much larger battle, the battle for her own heart and mind. And she wasn't sure yet who would win. The weeks that followed the confrontation were a blur for Claire. Each day felt like a tightrope walk between the past and the future, between the fragile threads of hope that she had tried to cling to and the gnawing, inevitable truth that was slowly creeping in. The life she had imagined with David was gone. But even though she knew it, even though she felt it in the pit of her stomach every time she saw him or thought about him, she couldn't shake the desperate need to fix what had broken. The painful paradox was that, for all of her anger, her hurt, and her betrayal, Claire still longed for the life she had been promised. She still wanted the love she thought they had shared. David had kept his word, at least to some extent. He continued to text her, to call her, to beg her for a second chance. He seemed to be doing everything he could to make amends, quitting his affair with Sarah, promising that he would work on himself, even suggesting that they attend counseling together. Claire, despite herself, had let him back into her life, but the longer it dragged on, the more she realized how misguided her actions were. Every time he reached out, she felt a mix of guilt and disbelief. "Why am I doing this?" she asked herself. "Why can't I just let go?" The first few times they met up, it was awkward. There were long pauses in conversation, moments where their eyes would lock, and Claire could feel the distance between them, a distance that had once been filled with love, laughter, and mutual respect. Now, it was like walking through a graveyard of their former selves. Claire found herself looking at him, searching for the man she once loved, the one who had held her hand at night and whispered sweet nothings into her ear. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who was too familiar and, at the same time, a complete stranger. David tried to be the man he thought Claire wanted him to be. He apologized constantly. He was on his best behavior. He made grand gestures, buying her flowers, trying to win her back with promises of change. But Claire couldn't help but wonder if it was all just a performance. Was he truly sorry, or was he simply afraid of losing her? His actions were so conflicted, so contradictory, that Claire found herself caught in a vicious cycle of hope and disappointment. She wanted to believe him, but every time she let her guard down, it felt like she was setting herself up for another heartache. Despite her initial resolve, Claire began to give in, piece by piece. She allowed herself to believe his words, the sweet things he said, the gentle promises of a brighter future. She allowed herself to imagine a life where they could start over, where the past could be forgotten, where their love could heal the wounds that had been inflicted. It felt almost right to try again. She couldn't deny that a part of her was still in love with him, despite everything. But every time she let herself believe that things could go back to normal, the weight of his betrayal would hit her like a slap across the face. It was in the way his eyes flickered nervously when he thought she wasn't looking, in the sudden shifts in his mood, in the small cracks in his facade. He was trying so hard to be the man she wanted him to be, but Claire couldn't shake the suspicion that something was still off. The love she had once felt for him began to erode under the pressure of his actions. There was a part of her that knew that no amount of apologies, no amount of effort, could ever undo the damage that had been done. One night, after a particularly emotional conversation, Claire found herself sitting alone in her apartment, feeling more lost than ever. She had agreed to give David another chance, to see where things would go, but in that moment, alone with her thoughts, she felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The walls of her apartment, once a place of comfort, of shared moments and plans for the future, felt suffocating. It was as if the very space she had once shared with David now held nothing but ghosts. The photographs of their travels, the little trinkets from their time together, now seemed like remnants of a life that had been nothing more than a lie. What did I want? Claire wondered. What was I hoping for? She had wanted the love she thought she had with David. She had wanted the security of knowing that she could trust him, that their future was solid, that they were partners in every sense of the word. But as the days stretched on, it became painfully clear to Claire that what she needed was far different from what she wanted. What she needed was to rebuild herself, to reclaim her sense of self-worth, and to trust that she was capable of living a life that didn't depend on David. The realization hit her in a wave of nausea, a sharp pang in her chest that nearly left her breathless. She had been so focused on fixing the relationship, on salvaging something that was broken beyond repair, that she had forgotten about herself. She had lost sight of the woman she used to be, the one who didn't need anyone else to feel whole, the one who had lived a life before David and could live a life after him. The next time David texted her, she hesitated. He wanted to meet again, to talk, to continue working on the relationship. But Claire could feel the walls inside her building higher. She didn't want to see him, not like this, not with all the cracks between them. And yet, she found herself torn. She had been living in a state of denial, convincing herself that if she just tried hard enough, if she just believed enough, she could fix what had been shattered. But as time passed, the truth was becoming inescapable. She had already paid a heavy price for what she had hoped for, a price that no amount of love or regret could undo. In a moment of clarity, Claire realized that the price of trying to salvage their relationship was her own peace of mind. She had been sacrificing her own happiness in the name of love, bending herself to David's needs and desires, pretending that everything would return to normal if they just tried harder. But she had been fooling herself. She wasn't the same woman she had been before all this happened. And neither was David. They were both different people now, shaped by the choices they had made, and no amount of apologies or grand gestures could change that. It was in the quiet of her apartment, alone with her thoughts, that Claire made the hardest decision of all. She couldn't keep living in the past, couldn't keep hoping for a future with David that was based on something that no longer existed. The relationship was beyond saving, and more importantly, Claire realized that she deserved more. She deserved a life where trust wasn't something she had to beg for, where love wasn't something she had to fight for. She deserved peace. The decision wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate. Claire spent the next few days vacillating between guilt and relief, between the desire to hold on to what she thought she wanted and the knowledge that she had to let go in order to heal. But eventually, she made the call. She told David she needed space, that she couldn't continue the relationship, that she had to focus on herself for a while. David's reaction was one of desperation, pleading, begging her to reconsider. But Claire stood firm. The truth was, she had already made the decision deep down. She knew that if she stayed with him, She would only be sacrificing herself, her happiness, her future. She had to pay the price of admitting that the person she had once been was gone, and that it was time to rebuild from the ground up. In the weeks that followed, Claire experienced a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, but also moments of profound clarity. The pain of losing David, of facing the reality of their broken relationship, was overwhelming, but it was also liberating. She began to rediscover herself, piece by piece, learning what it meant to be truly independent again. And while the road ahead was uncertain, and the hurt was still fresh, Claire knew that she was on the right path. The price she had paid for staying too long in a broken relationship was steep. But in letting go of the past, Claire began to reclaim the life she had almost forgotten she was capable of living, a life of her own, without compromise, without deceit. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but she was no longer bound by the past. She was free, and in that freedom, Claire found the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would no longer settle for anything less than the love and respect she truly deserved. The decision to leave David was one Claire had not made lightly. It was the culmination of weeks, months, even, of internal struggle, confusion, and self-doubt. She had been consumed by the desire to salvage a relationship that had long since passed its expiration date. But after the dust had settled, after she had made her choice, Claire realized that leaving was, paradoxically, the hardest and the most freeing thing she could have done. She had spent so much time trying to fix what was broken that she had neglected the one thing that needed mending the most: herself. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the loss of what could have been, a life with David, a life they had planned together. Relief because she was no longer weighed down by the heavy expectations of a relationship that was built on lies. But while the sadness was real, it was overshadowed by a new understanding, a revelation that came to Claire in fragments, moments of quiet reflection when she allowed herself to truly feel. At first, it felt like a period of mourning. She found herself walking through her apartment, seeing the remnants of their life together. The photos, the books, the small things that had once been tokens of shared love. It was a painful reminder of what she had lost, but Claire had to let herself feel it. She had to acknowledge the hurt in order to let it go. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, wondering if she had made the right choice, if she could have tried harder, if there was anything she could have done differently. But with time, those moments of doubt grew fewer. Claire started to realize that he was not the only one who had hurt her. She had hurt herself, too. She had allowed herself to stay in a toxic relationship, one where she had lost sight of her own worth. The truth, as painful as it was that David's betrayal had been a wake-up call, a catalyst for her own awakening. The truth wasn't that she had failed him or that she had somehow missed the signs. The truth was that she had failed herself. And that was the hardest lesson of all. But even as she worked through the pain and the heartbreak, Claire also began to find her way back to herself. She spent time rediscovering her passions, reading, traveling, taking long walks through the city at night. She had been so consumed by David and the relationship that she had lost track of the things that once brought her joy. Slowly, she started to reclaim those parts of herself. She remembered how much she loved writing, how it had been her outlet in the past, her escape from the world around her. One Saturday afternoon, as she sat by the window of a cafe, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the world pass by, she realized something startling. She was no longer afraid of being alone. She had been terrified at first, when the weight of her decision had hit her. What if I'm never loved again? What if I made a mistake? But the truth was, in that moment, Claire felt stronger than she had in years. She was finally standing on her own 2 feet, and while she still had moments of doubt and insecurity, she had come to understand something incredibly powerful about herself. She didn't need David, or anyone else for that matter, to define her worth. That realization was liberating. She could love herself, and she could be happy without needing someone else to fill the empty spaces. She had spent so much time in the shadows of someone else's mistakes, but now, she was beginning to step into the light. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing worth having ever was. But Claire was starting to believe in her own strength. She had come out of a toxic relationship, and while it had nearly broken her, it had also made her stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. Months passed. Claire re-entered the world slowly, taking tentative steps back into her social circles, reconnecting with old friends, and even starting to date again. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but each step forward felt like a small victory. She had learned how to set boundaries, how to protect herself emotionally, and how to recognize her own value. The scars of her past were still there, but they were no longer the defining features of who she was. It was during this time of self-discovery that Claire found herself thinking about David again. The anger, the betrayal, the sense of injustice that had once consumed her had faded. She could still feel the echoes of that heartbreak, but it no longer had the power to control her. She thought about him, about the man he had been to her, and about the choices he had made. She thought about the girl he had left her for, the lies he had told, and the promises he had broken. But she also thought about the good things, the moments of joy they had shared, the laughter, the trips they had taken, the dreams they had once built together. She remembered the person she had been when they were happy, the person who had believed in love and trust, and the person who had felt like they were building a future together. But with each passing day, she came to understand that that woman no longer existed. And, maybe more importantly, she realized that she no longer wanted to be her. The girl who had once defined herself by her relationship, by her role as David's partner, was gone. And while it was painful to admit, it was also a necessary part of the journey. When David reached out to her again, it was unexpected. Claire had moved on, or so she thought. She had stopped obsessing over the past, stopped waiting for some kind of closure or reconciliation. But there he was, sending her a message out of the blue, asking if they could meet. It wasn't the first time he had tried to reach out. He had texted and called several times before, but this time felt different. His words were more tentative, more vulnerable.
He wanted to talk, he said.
To explain himself. To apologize, truly apologize, for everything that had happened. Claire was hesitant at first. She had already made her peace with the past. She didn't want to go backward. She didn't need him anymore. But something in his tone made her pause. It wasn't about forgiveness. She had already forgiven him, in a sense, for her own peace of mind. But this felt different. It felt like a final chapter, a necessary step for both of them to move on for good. So, she agreed. The meeting took place in a quiet park on the outskirts of the city. It was a neutral ground, a place where neither of them had any expectations or memories attached. When Claire saw David for the first time in months, she was struck by how much had changed. He looked different, tired, thinner, more subdued, but also more sincere. There was no trace of the confident, self-assured man who had walked out on her at the altar. This was a man who had been humbled, who had learned, through pain and loss, the consequences of his actions. "Claire," he said, his voice soft, almost apologetic.
"I'm sorry."
"I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I've changed. I've had time to reflect, to understand the pain I caused you." Claire nodded, feeling a weight in her chest. She had expected this moment, had braced herself for it, but now that it was here, she felt no anger, no bitterness. Just sadness. Sadness for what could have been. Sadness for what had been lost. But there was no longer any desire to pick up the broken pieces and try to make them fit again. "I know," Claire said simply. "I know you're sorry, David. But the truth is I've changed too. And I can't go back to what we were. I can't go back to that version of myself either." He looked at her, as if searching for some glimmer of hope, but Claire could see it in his eyes. He knew. He knew that they had both moved on, in different ways. He had his own journey to make, one where he would learn to live with the consequences of his betrayal. And Claire had her own path, one where she would continue to grow, to heal, and to reclaim the life that had once been stolen from her. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Claire said, her voice calm and steady.
"I truly do."
And with that, they parted ways. There were no tears, no dramatic goodbyes. Just a simple acknowledgement of the end and the acceptance of a new truth for both of them. Claire had come full circle. She had learned, the hard way, that love was not just about sacrifice and compromise, it was about self-respect, trust, and mutual growth. As Claire walked away from that park, a quiet sense of peace settled over her. She wasn't who she used to be, and that was okay. She had learned from her mistakes, faced her demons, and come out stronger on the other side. And though the future was still uncertain, Claire knew one thing for sure. She was going to be okay. In the end, Claire didn't need to return to her familiar situation. She had found a new one where she was no longer defined by the past, by David, or by anyone else's choices. She had returned to herself, and that was enough.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.